The church bells chimed once, at dawn, and already the village was alive with subtle rituals of attraction. Courtship among 14th-century English peasants was neither romantic nor particularly private. Unlike the courtly love of the nobility, passion was whispered behind castle walls, or written in poetic verse. The lives of ordinary people were exposed to the eyes and ears of their entire community. When you lived in a one-room cottage with parents, siblings, goats, and perhaps a pig or two, secrecy was an unaffordable luxury. Courtship wasn't just a personal endeavor, was a public negotiation of survival. Opportunities for young people to mingle were often tied to the rhythms of labor. The May Day festival, the harvest feast, and even the regular gatherings at the alehouse served as de facto dating rituals. Church was the center of spiritual life, but also a surprisingly potent arena for flirtation. Peasant boys and girls were typically separated by gender during Mass, but lingering after the sermon, especially during feast days, offered rare and cherished opportunities to exchange glances, laughter, and occasional physical closeness. In some regions, dairying was an excuse for mixed-sex overnight labor, when young men and women would herd cattle to remote pastures. There, away from the moral surveillance of the village, they engaged in flirtation, storytelling, and yes, sometimes sex. The line between honest courting and sinful lust was thin, and often interpreted by local gossip and later by the courts. Unlike modern dating, courtship was less about love and more about intention. Was he able to support a wife? Did she'll have good hips for bearing children and managing housework? Tokens were exchanged: wooden spoons carved by hand, ribbons, or even small pouches of salt or honey. These objects were not ornamental, they signified commitment. A girl might wear a wreath made of oak leaves to announce her availability. A boy might show up at a festival wearing the colored ribbon of a girl he fancied. Some villages practiced bundling, a curious northern custom wherein two betrothed individuals were allowed to sleep in the same bed, often fully clothed, and sometimes even tied in sacks. It was thought to test their virtue. In practice, however, bundling often led to pregnancies before marriage, something not entirely frowned upon in every region. Marriage was less a religious sacrament than a public agreement. Before the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, marriages could be conducted privately with no priest present. What mattered was consent, spoken aloud and witnessed. Even into the 14th century, a couple could be considered married if they exchanged vows in front of a handful of witnesses and consummated the union. There was no white dress, no cake, and no kiss at the altar. Instead, there was ale, lots of ale, and bread, and dancing, and the obligatory bedding ceremony. It sounds shocking to modern sensibilities, but the bedding ceremony was often a raucous and public event. After the feasting, the couple would be led to the marital bed, sometimes by torchlight, surrounded by singing and jests. The bride and groom might be stripped to their shift by friends or family members, and the bedding itself sometimes witnessed, at least symbolically, by a few elders to guarantee the marriage had been sealed. Some households would place symbolic items beneath the bed: grain for fertility, garlic for protection, and even a bowl of ale as an offering to household spirits. And yet, the question remains: how much of this was ritual, and how much was real? Was the bedding ceremony truly about sex, or was it about control? A community's claim over the private lives of its members. It's important to pause and consider the uncomfortable reality of agency. While stories of mutual attraction and peasant romance exist, they were often filtered through the expectations of economic survival. A daughter was both a blessing and a burden. Her marriage could secure an alliance, offer relief from feeding another mouth, or bring in a dowry. Girls were usually married between 14 and 18. Boys were typically older, sometimes by a decade or more. The disparity in age often reflected their ability to inherit land or afford marriage at all. Premarital sex was frequent but heavily judged, especially if pregnancy followed without a clear path to marriage. And yet, not all unions were forced or loveless. Some peasant couples married for love, wrote letters where literacy permitted, and stayed together long after duty had faded. But what happened when a couple was caught courting in secret, or when a pregnancy preceded a wedding? The village didn't simply look away. They turned to the manorial court. What would happen to a couple caught breaking the rules of courtship, kissing in the fields, sleeping in the same bed without witnesses, or bearing a child out of wedlock? Would the courts punish, or would the village quietly look the other way? The road to marriage in the medieval countryside was not a private affair. It was a spectacle, performed, scrutinized, and sometimes punished. The courtship practices we explored earlier were just one half of the story. The other half belonged to the manorial courts. If love bloomed under the watchful eyes of neighbors, then punishment followed under the keen attention of local justice. The manorial court was the primary legal body for rural England's peasantry, presided over by the local lord or his steward. These sessions were held regularly, sometimes monthly or quarterly, undealt with local disputes, transgressions, and breaches of custom. While many of the cases involved land disputes, grazing rights, or failed dues, a startling portion of court rolls reveals something more intimate: charges of fornication, adultery, broken betrothals, and pregnancies out of wedlock. These were not anonymous complaints. The village watched, reported, and testified in a world where communal reputation was everything. Sexual transgressions were public scandals. Betrothals were legally binding. A promise made especially in front of witnesses was considered a contract. If one party broke it, the other could bring them to court for breach of troth. Damages were assessed, reputations scrutinized, and sometimes marriages were forced as punishment. What might today seem like a teenage romance gone sour could easily spiral into years of litigation, shame, and ostracization. Take, for instance, the case of Alice of Holkett, recorded in a 1325 court roll. She accused a young man named Thomas of lying with her thrice and promising marriage. Thomas denied both the promise and the sex, but Alice brought forth two witnesses who claimed to have seen them together in the fields after Michaelmas. The steward ruled in Alice's favor. Thomas was fined, the promise upheld, and a marriage arranged under pressure. The village remembered premarital sex was technically a sin, one which had to be confessed before communion. But in practice, it was nearly universal. Church and court alike spent more time regulating the consequences than preventing the act itself. A 14th century record from Devonshire lists over a dozen fines in a single year for lechery or fornication. In many of these cases, the woman was pregnant, and the man was fined or ordered to marry her. Sometimes he fled. Sometimes the woman claimed the child was begotten in love, and bore the social weight alone. The church may have preached abstinence, but the village understood the practicalities. Farming required hands, women needed security, men needed heirs. And so, testing a partner before marriage was a quietly accepted risk, but it was still punishable. Punishment came not just in the form of fines, but in spectacle. A couple might be paraded through the village in nothing but their undergarments, or forced to walk with their shirts turned inside out. Public penance was common. A woman might stand barefoot outside the church, holding a candle, confessing her sin. The stocks, a wooden frame that clamped ankles, was a favored device for more egregious offenses. There, in the village square, the offender could be mocked, pelted with dung or rotten food, and humiliated. But punishment was not equal. Women bore a disproportionate burden, particularly unmarried mothers. The label of whore was difficult to shed, even when the pregnancy resulted from assault, or from promises broken by men of higher status. This is where the village's duality revealed itself, capable of immense cruelty, but also sometimes pragmatic mercy. If a pregnancy occurred, the midwife became a central, though often invisible, figure in the resolution of scandal. More than a birth attendant, the midwife was part confessor, part healer, and part social mediator. She might lie on a woman's behalf, claim the child was born too early to survive, or even help falsify birth timing to make it seem legitimate. This wasn't necessarily out of kindness, it was survival. An unwed mother might lose her position as a servant, be barred from the fields, or denied communion. Her child could be branded a bastard, unable to inherit land. So midwives became quiet conspirators in bending social norms when justice proved too rigid. In medieval England, legitimacy mattered not just to the church, but to property. Bastard children, even if loved, could not inherit unless formally acknowledged and legitimized. For peasant families with small plots or cottage rights, this was a critical concern, and yet records show many bastards were raised within households without being cast out. They were sometimes sent to monasteries, fostered by kin, or absorbed into labor roles by age 10. The community gossiped, yes, but life went on. Fields had to be tilled, bread had to be baked. Some women remarried, some never married at all, but raised their children as spinsters, a term that originally meant a woman who spun wool to survive. But what about love? Was there room for affection in these arrangements of survival? Historical evidence suggests both. In the rare instances where letters between peasant couples have survived, we find affection, longing, and deep commitment. In court records, there are also cases of lovers fighting to stay together against their families' wishes. One record from 1382 shows a couple who ran away from their village after being forbidden to marry. They were eventually captured and brought back. Rather than be separated, they knelt before the steward, hands clasped, and begged for clemency. The steward ruled in their favor. The village celebrated. Not all stories ended in stocks or shame. The village remembered everything. In communities of under 200 people, every scandal, every pregnancy, every broken promise became part of a living oral record. These stories lingered. They shaped reputations, marriages, even opportunities for children. And yet, sometimes, the village forgot willingly. A young woman left for a neighboring hamlet, returned 2 years later with a cousin's child, and no one asked questions. A boy claimed his mother was a widow, though no one recalled a husband. A couple appeared on the rolls as married, though no one remembered a wedding. The truth was flexible. Memory could be kind, but often the court records had already spoken. What happened after the wedding feast faded and the laughter stopped? How did couples manage their new lives in cramped homes, with parents nearby, winters biting, and survival always at hand? What was married life really like for medieval peasants? The wedding ale was drunk, the songs were sung, the bedding ceremony, symbolic or real, was done, and so began the true work of medieval marriage, cohabitation. But this wasn't marriage as modern minds might imagine it. There were no honeymoons, no privacy, and precious little time for tenderness. The peasant household was a unit of economic production, first, emotional refuge, second. To survive, you needed a partner, not just in bed, but in toil, hardship, and childering. Most English peasant homes in the 14th century were one-room structures, sometimes with a small loft under a thatched roof, but more often a single open space with a fire pit in the center and a hole in the ceiling to vent the smoke. Within that room lived not only the husband and wife, but often their children, aging parents, and any livestock too valuable to leave outside. Chickens, a goat, or even a calf might sleep in the corner. A couple's entire life unfolded under the gaze of kin, beasts, and hearth. Privacy, as we understand it, didn't exist. If you were lucky, you had a bed with a curtain. If you were very lucky, the bed wasn't shared with others. Marriage was not a division of emotional labor, but of physical tasks. The wife managed the home, baked bread, fed livestock, spun wool, cared for children, and often joined her husband in the fields. During harvest, entire families worked from dawn to dusk. Marriage was a labor contract sealed in flesh. Men typically plowed, sowed, and dealt with manor officials. Women tended gardens, preserved food, brewed ale, and bore children. And yet, these roles were flexible. If a man fell ill, a woman took the plow. If a woman died in childbirth, the man learned to cook. Necessity forced collaboration. Marriage, in this context, was less about compatibility and more about competency. Did she wake early? Did he manage his land shares? Did she keep the bread from burning? Did he drink too much ale? These were the metrics of a successful union, and yet somewhere beneath the toil and smoke, intimacy persisted. A stolen moment in the fields, a hand on the small of the back by the fire, a joke shared while mucking the yard. The resilience of affection amid hardship is as old as humanity itself. Most evidence for peasant intimacy comes not from letters which peasants rarely wrote, but from indirect glimpses, lullabies passed down orally, herbal love potions recorded in church complaints, or the rare presence of matching grave markers with entwined inscriptions. Even the church, for all its fire and brimstone, acknowledged the need for marital pleasure, so long as it was within the bounds of procreation. Sex was expected regularly. It was considered the wife's duty and the husband's right, but it could also be in quiet and unrecorded moments. Desired pregnancy followed swiftly for most peasant women, with no reliable birth control and limited understanding of fertility. A woman might give birth to 6 to 8 children across her life, yet infant mortality was staggering. In some villages, 30 to 50% of children died before age 5. Many women watched child after child die from fever, hunger, or cold, often buried with only a wooden cross or a mark in the church roll. Married love was marked by this griefy shared silence over tiny shrouds, or the muffled sobs in a straw bed when the midwife shook her head, and still life went on. Fields had to be sown, goats had to be milked. Peasant marriage was a bond forged in repeated acts of survival. Not all marriages were happy. Records of manorial courts and ecclesiastical tribunals detail complaints of beatings, desertions, and infidelity. While the church idealized the obedient wife and the sober husband, real life was messier. A husband might disappear for months seeking work. A wife might take a lover while her husband lay ill. Some women attempted to poison abusive husbands, usually with herbs known only to midwives or wise women. Divorce, as we understand it, was nearly impossible. Annulments were granted only under rare conditions: consanguinity, non-consummation, or bigamy. Most couples, once bound, remained so for life. However, separations both legal and informal did occur. A man might move to a different village. A woman might return to her kin, but for most, marriage endured, not out of love, necessarily, but out of a lack of options. Despite all this, many marriages endured in quiet partnership. They attended Mass together, sowed fields side by side, shared stale bread on winter nights, and watched children grow into adulthood only to start the cycle again. The fire was rarely warm. The food was rarely full. The days were long. But perhaps, in the soft hush of a shared blanket, with frost forming at the edges of the door, a wife and husband might whisper old jokes, recount the village gossip, or remember a springtime dance from decades ago. That too is love. It's important to remember, no two villages were the same. Marriage customs in Norfolk differed from those in Cornwall. The influence of Celtic traditions lingered in the Welsh marches. Scandinavian legacies remained strong in the Danelaw. Some villages celebrated unions with songs, others demanded dowries. Some lords interfered constantly, others cared little, but in nearly every case, marriage was necessary. It ensured the passing of land, the rearing of children, and the stability of labor. The marriage bed was where life began too often, where women's health ended. Historians often focus on kings and battles. But the medieval village endured because of these unions: arranged, passionate, loveless, loving. The ordinary people, whose names never made it into history books, held up entire economies, cultures, and faiths through the quiet labor of marriage. Peasant marriage was not glamorous, but it was resilient. And if there's a lesson to draw from the bed of the medieval peasant, it is this: love is not always a song. Sometimes it's a shared loaf, a patched tunic, a saved onion for the stew. Love, in the Middle Ages, was a quiet kind of work. In the end, what we know of peasant marriage is drawn from records of conflict, court, and custom, but the laughter, the small joys, and the deep affections were rarely recorded. How many tender moments have we lost to time, hidden between the lines of dusty court rolls and forgotten thatched roofs? Imagine being a young peasant bride in a 13th century village. You've survived adolescence, found a husband with access to a plow and to oxen, and now stand on the edge of a hard-earned future. But instead of a quiet wedding night, there's a knock at the door. A messenger from the lord of the manor arrives. He says, "The lord must lie with you first." This tale, repeated in countless fictional works, is known as the rite of the first night, also called just prime noctis or droit du seigneur. The idea that feudal lords could legally take the virginity of peasant brides on their wedding night has echoed through history like a dark whisper. But did it actually happen? Or is it one of the most persistent myths about medieval life? The first and most important truth is this: there is no concrete legal evidence from medieval Europe explicitly codifying the rite of the first night as a widespread institutionalized law. No manorial roll, no English common law record, no papal bull clearly states that a lord had the automatic legal right to have sex with a serf's bride. And yet, the idea persists. Why? The answer is twofold: power and symbolism. Even if the legal structure didn't enshrine this right, the social hierarchy may have enabled behaviors that felt functionally indistinguishable to peasants. In a world where the lord controlled your land, your access to common grazing, your tithes, and your legal fate, saying no was complicated. The notion of a ruling class claiming sexual access to their inferiors isn't medieval in origin. Roman accounts speak of similar customs among conquered peoples. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote that certain tribal kings demanded virgins as tribute. These ideas were carried into the medieval world through classical texts and through the Church's retellings of pagan immorality. The droit du seigneur, as we understand it, today gained particular traction in late medieval and Renaissance literature. The 18th century Enlightenment, with its desire to critique feudalism and monarchy, picked up the myth and amplified it. Voltaire, in Droit du Seigneur, 1762, used it to mock aristocratic corruption. Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro dramatized the idea with farce and sexual tension, portraying the count attempting to seduce his servant's bride. These were critiques of nobility, not reliable historical accounts, and yet they shaped the popular imagination more than any surviving law code ever did. Let's step back from the myth and ask, if not institutionalized rape, what were the actual sexual dynamics between lords and their serfs? First, we must acknowledge the vast power imbalance. A medieval peasant was dependent on the lord for access to land protection, judicial authority, freedom to marry, relief from fines or taxes. The lord could refuse permission for marriage, especially if it took a laborer away from the manor or involved someone from another estate. This merchet fine payment for marrying off a daughter was a real and documented practice. In some regions, a father had to pay his lord if his daughter married without permission. Could that permission be withheld or manipulated to extract other favors? Almost certainly, but the records don't always tell us how. What we have are hints. Legal documents do record instances of rape, coercion, and seduction, but not in the way the just prime noctis legend suggests. In some cases, peasants accused lords or stewards of taking liberties with servant girls or widows under duress. Women might appeal to the bishop's court or the king's justices, but these were rare and difficult cases to prove, especially when the accuser was a serf and the accused a nobleman. And then there's the issue of silence. Many Medieval sources, especially manorial court rolls, simply omit sexual violence, unless it disrupted the social order. A servant girl impregnated by the reeve might be fined for fornication. The reeve's name might never appear. This isn't evidence that such abuses didn't happen. It's evidence that they weren't seen as legal violations, at least not against the woman. The law, after all, was more concerned with property and paternity than with consent. Some rituals may have resembled symbolic versions of the first night. In a few European villages, lords claimed the right to sit on the bride's bed, remove her garter, or even hand her over to her husband. These symbolic gestures affirmed the lord's control, not necessarily his desire. For instance, in some Catalan regions, lords were required to bless the marriage bed as a sign of feudal dominion. In parts of Scotland, a tradition known as curiality involved a fee to the lord to waive any symbolic rights over a new bride. These gestures were not literal exercises of sexual rights, but they reinforced the idea that the lord was always watching, always present. Humiliation, not consummation, was the tool of control, while married peasant women were generally not subjected to overt institutional abuse. Unmarried women in servitude, kitchen maids, dairy girls, and shepherdesses were extremely vulnerable. Lords, clergy, and their stewards had easy access to these women, and little incentive to restrain themselves. The ecclesiastical courts were inundated with cases involving illegitimate children, especially those fathered by clerics. Many young girls were in service from age 12 or 13, an age at which they could be legally married. Their position left them exposed. If a pregnancy occurred, the burden of shame, legal responsibility, and economic survival fell squarely on their shoulders. The male employer might pay a token fine, or nothing at all. This was the real face of sexual coercion in the medieval world. Less ceremonial, more mundane, hidden not by law, but by indifference. Because, for peasants, fear was a currency. The lord could make life impossible without ever touching you. A rumor could spread. A steward could deny your marriage petition. A dowry could be withheld. The idea of the first night was not just about sex. It was about the looming shadow of authority, how it could reach into the most personal corner of your life, even your bed. Whether or not the Lord ever knocked on your door, the possibility hung in the air. But what if a woman did become pregnant by a lord or priest? What happened to the child? How did the village respond? And how did the church preaching virtue handle its own scandals? If medieval lords were feared for their power, priests were feared and sometimes revered for their proximity to God. They were literate. They had authority over sin and forgiveness. And yet, within the quiet boundaries of rural parishes, priests fathered children, seduced servant girls, and occasionally maintained mistresses with the kind of discretion known only to those shielded by robes and rank. When a woman bore a child out of wedlock, and the father was a man of the cloth or a man of status, the scandal rippled far beyond the cradle. But before exploring the church's complicity, let's begin with the children themselves. Children born outside of wedlock were called bastards, not merely an insult, but a legal and social designation with real consequences. They could not inherit land or property unless specifically legitimized, which was a rare and complex process. In the peasant world, where inheritance was often limited to a cottage, a cow, or a small strip of land, Even a minor exclusion meant economic ruin. Yet, these children were not always cast out. They were often absorbed into the household as a labor source, taken in by extended family, or quietly acknowledged as the son or daughter of the mother's husband Evan when everyone knew otherwise. The community, especially in smaller villages, sometimes chose silence over scandal. But the mother's fate was often harsher. An unmarried mother could be brought before the manorial court, fined for fornication, and if she could not pass, subjected to public penance. This might involve standing barefoot outside the parish church, holding a candle, wearing a white sheet during Mass, confessing publicly during a Sunday sermon. For repeat offenses, punishment could escalate, increased fines, social exile, or even whipping in extreme cases. In contrast, the manif identified might be fined as well. But if he were a priest or a nobleman, he was often untouchable. This was the invisible wall of status, and nowhere was it more apparent than with the clergy. The Catholic Church mandated celibacy for priests by the 12th century. In theory, this meant that priests were to be wholly devoted to God, unmarred by the distractions of women or children. In practice, many rural priests maintained concubines, sometimes openly. The church frowned upon this, but local enforcement was lax. Priests who fathered children were supposed to be removed or disciplined, but it rarely happened. Wealthier clergy often paid a fine called collegium, a kind of tolerated tax that allowed them to keep a concubine while remaining in office. Yes, celibacy had a price tag. This quiet system allowed the church to maintain its spiritual ideal while turning a blind eye to human reality. Parishioners were expected to respect their priest's authority, even as his mistress served the Mass wine. Young women in service to the church, particularly those working in rectories or monastic households, were especially vulnerable. Many entered service around the age of 12 or 13, doing laundry, cooking, and cleaning. Their dependency on the church for food and shelter made them easy targets. Should a girl become pregnant, she bore the brunt of the punishment. The priest might deny the affair, claim she seduced him, or transfer her to another village. In most cases, the child was born into social limbo, and the mother's reputation was irrevocably tarnished. Few dared to accuse a priest outright. If they did, they faced not only the village's suspicion, but the wrath of church courts, which often protected their own. Ecclesiastical courts were supposed to uphold morality. They dealt with marriage disputes, fornication, adultery, and spiritual offenses. But when the accused was a priest, the system protected itself. Cases against clergy were dragged out for years. Witnesses were intimidated or dismissed. Penalties were light, often involving penance or a temporary reassignment. True excommunication or defrocking was rare. Even the few written records that survive show a pattern of subtle manipulation. Brother Thomas is to do penance for the improper company of a woman, fathering a child, but continues to serve. A fine is paid in lieu of removal. And so the cycle continued. The spiritual shepherd became the silent predator. In rare but revealing cases, villagers protested. One such case in 1378 involved a Yorkshire priest accused of maintaining 2 mistresses and fathering for children. Parishioners refused to attend Mass, withheld tithes, and eventually appealed to the bishop. The priest was removed not for moral failure, but for disrupting the peace. In another account from Lincolnshire, a pregnant servant girl was defended by her family, who confronted the steward and physically blocked a priest from entering the rectory. These moments were rare. Most went unrecorded, but they speak to a quiet resistance. The line between fear and dignity was sometimes crossed, and when it was, the village rose up not with swords, but with silence, refusal, and stubborn truth. Even when no official protest occurred, villagers remembered. Stories of predatory priests and lecherous lords passed into folklore. The black-robed man who visited girls by moonlight, the steward whose own daughter was born of sin, the castle ghost said to be a scorned servant girl who died in childbirth. These tales served two purposes. They warned the youngest, especially girls, to be wary of power disguised as piety. They preserved memory long after official records faded or were scrubbed clean. In this way, history continued, not in parchment, but in story. One might ask, why didn't people do more? But this question misunderstands the structure of power. A peasant family could not afford to alienate the church or the Lord. Doing so meant loss of land, fines, legal trouble, or worse, expulsion from the village. And so, silence became a form of survival. Even the church taught that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. Was that comfort or control? Either way, women bore the cost in body, in shame, and in the difficult lives of children born from power's abuse. But how did these dynamics shape future generations? Could a bastard child ever rise above their station? Were there paths for redemption or even revenge in a world ruled by blood and name? What became of the children left behind? Drawn curtains in the presence of a midwife who says little and writes nothing. No father is named, no ceremony marks the event. The mother, young, unmarried, and dependent, quietly returns to her daily labor, now with a child on her hip and a shadow on her name. Such was the fate of many children conceived in the blurred boundary between consent and coercion. But not all of them remained shadows. Over time, some bastards became craftsmen, stewards, even clerics themselves. A few managed to climb the social ladder not despite their birth, but because of it. For even the illegitimate bore, sometimes, the blood of power. In medieval society, legitimacy was the cornerstone of inheritance. A legitimate son could claim land, titles, and the family name. A bastard, regardless of his father's wealth or status, could not. This legal boundary created both a problem and a loophole. For noblemen, illegitimate children posed a threat. If acknowledged, they might press claims to land or titles. If ignored, they might still carry influence through rumor, appearance, or talent. This is why, in noble families, bastards were sometimes sent to monasteries to become monks or scribes, assigned military roles as squires or foot soldiers, married off to lesser families to secure loyalty among peasants. However, the stakes were different. A bastard child meant another mouth to feed, another name to protect, and sometimes another tool in the hands of those with power. For most bastard children in rural villages, life was shaped by social memory. Even if their identity wasn't officially marked, the village often remembered. Names were passed down: John, the priest's son, Agnes of the mill, quiet reminders of their parentage. These children faced certain barriers. They might be excluded from guild apprenticeships. They could be denied courtship by families, guarding their own reputations. They often inherited no land and were expected to leave home early to serve in another manner. And yet, the medieval world was not a monolith. Hardship bred resilience. Many such children learned trades, joined religious orders, or became essential members of their community. A good hand at the forge, after all, was more useful than a clean pedigree. Sometimes the community forgave, especially if the mother remained pious, hard-working, and quiet. In rare instances, the child was quietly supported by the father, especially if the father held guilt, affection, or political ambition. A lord might arrange for a son to become a reeve or land agent. A priest might ensure his daughter entered a convent with a dowry. A monk might divert monastery funds to support his niece. These arrangements were unspoken but deeply understood. In other cases, the child became a pawn, used to blackmail the father, or, if the mother was accused of seduction, used to ruin her, and sometimes, or buried in an unmarked grave. The church preached that all souls were equal before God, but in practice, bloodlines were everything. Ironically, that forbade their existence. The church, especially in its more pragmatic rural forms, needed educated men. Bastards of minor clergy or nobles were sometimes trained in reading and Latin and entered the clergy themselves. The logic was simple. They were already denied inheritance. They had no marital claims. Their loyalty could be shaped in time. Some bastard sons became abbots, scribes, even bishops. Their birth was never erased, but it was cloaked in the language of service. One 14th century chronicler remarked of a powerful bishop, born of sin, but armored in God. Occasionally, the lines reversed. A child abandoned or ignored grow into a steward, land agent, or cleric who came to wield real local power. There are recorded cases, though rare, where such men brought charges against former lords or priests, withheld favors from families that once mocked their mothers, or used their position to rewrite their own origin. In this we find the medieval version of poetic justice, not through violence, but through tenure, who kept the tithe rolls, the bastard son, who oversaw the plow schedules, the woman's child, who now listened to confessions, the priest's forgotten progeny. The medieval world rarely offered revenge, but it sometimes offered irony. For the ordinary peasant, questions of legitimacy were often subordinate to survival. Was the child strong? Did they help in the fields? Were they respectful? Could they be trusted? If so, the stain of illegitimacy faded, especially in small communities where practical value outweighed abstract sin. There were even folk practices meant to cleanse a bastard, rituals involving herbs, baptisms that sought to undo the shame through nature or magic. These customs never made it into official doctrine, but they lived in practice, in the murky overlap between sin, superstition, and necessity. Peasants carved out paths to dignity. The legend of just prime noctis may not have been literal, but the truth it obscures is just as dark. A world where power could coerce without laws, and where silence preserved the comfort of the powerful. That legacy lingers. We still live with questions about consent, abuse of authority, and the invisibility of survivors. But we also live with the echoes of resilience. Children born under shame who built churches, mothers mocked by villagers who lived long enough to see their sons preach, servant girls who refused to disappear. What then do we inherit from these forgotten lives? Perhaps not their names, but their truths, that power wears many faces, that dignity can exist without status, and that even in the margins of history, not from the church. If the Lord ruled the land, the church ruled the body and soul. And nowhere was this more evident than in its quiet obsession with desire. Not just sinful acts, but sinful thoughts, lustful dreams, wandering eyes, even the movements of the flesh when no one else was watching. The medieval church didn't merely preach against adultery or fornication, it categorized, catalogued, interrogated, and punished even the most private of indiscretions. And the village priest, more than a man of God, became a moral surveillance system, taking confession, assigning penance, and feeding the ecclesiastical courts with whispered sins. Welcome to the moral bureaucracy of the Middle Ages. By the 12th century, following the reforms of the Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, confession became mandatory at least once a year. Parishioners were expected to confess all mortal sins to their priest and perform the prescribed penance. And central among these sins of the flesh, these included, but were not limited to, fornication, sex outside of marriage, adultery, sex with a married person, masturbation called self-pollution or onanism, homosexual acts, bestiality, incest, lustful thoughts, or dreams not proved, marital sex, yes, even between spouses. The church was not only concerned with who you had sex with, but how, when, and why. Did you do it for pleasure or procreation? Did you do it on Sunday, during Lent, with the lights on? Even within marriage, sex was to be approached with sobriety, silence, and a spiritual purpose. The idea that a husband and wife might seek one another out purely for enjoyment was considered deeply suspicious to guide priests in their new role as moral inquisitors. Penitential manuals were developed, books outlining every imaginable sin and its appropriate punishment. A 13th century manual might advise, if a man sleeps with his wife on a feast day, let him fast for 7 days on bread and water. If a woman entices a man with her hair uncovered, let her walk barefoot to the church. If a youth pollutes himself while dreaming, let him say 50 These manuals read like a fusion of law code, spiritual doctrine, and uncomfortable curiosity. They reveal a world where bodily impulses were moral crimes, and ignorance was no defense. The job of the priest was to extract these confessions, and to do so, he asked questions. The medieval confessional was not a box hidden behind a screen. It was often a bench or corner in the open air, near the church or beside the altar. And the priest did not wait for you to speak. He asked, have you lain with your spouse outside of the proper times? Have you touched yourself impurely? Have you had thoughts of another woman during union? Have you known a beast in any way unclean? The line between spiritual care and invasive interrogation blurred. For peasants, many of whom had little concept of theology, the confessional was both sacred and terrifying. Some confessed too much, fearing damnation. Others held back, unsure whether dreams counted. Others lied, but risked spiritual peril. The priest, in turn, he spoke of it to others. Though confessions were supposed to be private, the thin walls of the village allowed little secrecy. A priest might hint in a sermon at wickedness among the maidens. A midwife might learn of a penance involving herbs or fasting. A husband might grow suspicious of his wife's sudden desire to fast every Wednesday. The result? A community where reputation and rumor became moral currency. A woman who knelt for too long in church might be thought guilty. A man who avoided confession might be hiding adultery. A girl forced to walk barefoot during Lent had clearly done more than gossip, and yet, appropriately, you could be forgiven. This was revolutionary. In a world where justice often meant humiliation, violence, or fines, the Church offered a spiritual reset. Once sins were confessed, penance was assigned. The severity varied based on the sin, the sinner's gender, their social status, whether the act was repeated. Common penances included fasting on bread and water, repetition of prayers, often hundreds of Ave Marias, pilgrimages to nearby shrines wearing specific garments, a rope belt, public confession, or ritualized shame. Rarely, especially in monastic settings, corporal punishment was used: flagellation, self-whipping, or walking barefoot over thorns. Importantly, wealthier sinners could sometimes commute their penance money to the Church in exchange for a lighter burden. This early spiritual economy foreshadowed later abuses that would trigger the Reformation. But for the poor, there was only bread, water, and long days of repentance. While both men and women confessed, women were often judged more harshly, especially when their sins involved sexuality. A man who confessed to sleeping with a servant might receive 7 days of fasting. A servant girl who confessed to seducing a master might be given public penance or exiled from her post. The Church assumed that female desire was more dangerous, more deceptive, and more responsible for male failure. The biblical legacy of Eve, she who tempted Adam, shaped every expectation of peasant women's behavior. Confessing a sin meant risking more than spiritual consequences. It meant losing one's place in the household, one's chance at marriage, or one's children. And still, many confessed out of fear, out of belief, or simply because the village had already decided their guilt. To modern eyes, the Church's moral regime may seem oppressive, an institution obsessed with control, shame, and submission. But for many peasants, it was also a source of order, purpose, and even comfort. Confession allowed for renewal. Penance offered a path back into the community. Sin, once named, could be washed away, not with violence, but with prayer. And in a world with few safety nets, the Church often cared for the sick, buried the dead, and offered meaning in suffering. The same priest who questioned you about lust might also offer bread during famine, or bless your newborn. In this contradiction lay the Church's power, both jailer and savior, guardian of morality and supplier of mercy. But what happened when confession failed? When secret sins grew too large to hide, or when priests themselves fell prey to lust? What did the Church do when its own flesh proved sinful? In the ideal world the Church imagined, priests were spiritual beacons, celibate, pious, and vigilant guardians of morality. In the real world of the medieval village, they were flawed, mensome, devout, some indifferent, and some deeply entangled in the very sins they condemned. The contradiction was glaring, and the closer one looked at the daily lives of parish priests, monks, and church officials, the more apparent it became. The institution that most fiercely regulated desire was itself haunted by it. Since the 12th century, the Catholic Church had required all priests to remain celibate. The idea was that abstaining from fleshly desires made one more spiritually pure, more devoted to God. But enforcement was inconsistent, especially in rural areas. In villages where the bishop visited only once every few years, if at all, priests often lived with concubines, fathered children, and quietly arranged for their housekeepers to inherit small estates. The villagers usually knew, and yet many accepted it so long as it didn't become a public scandal. After all, a priest who kept a quiet mistress might still say Mass on time, offer food to the poor, visit the sick during plague, bury the dead when no one else would. The community valued function over purity. But when these affairs turned exploitative, or when the priest's sin became impossible to ignore, the fragile illusion of moral authority collapsed. Church records often use the Latin word mulier, literally woman, to describe a priest's concubine in the margins of court rolls and bishops' registers. These women appear anonymously. The priest of Langham is admonished for cohabiting with a mulier in the rectory. Father Walter is fined 5 shillings for fathering a child upon his servant. A woman known to the village as the priest's concubine is excommunicated for refusing to leave. Some priests married their lovers in secretist before the strict reforms of Lateran, for others attempted to pass them off as relatives or boarders. In tight-knit villages, no one was fooled, and yet many of these women were not seduced but trapped by circumstance. Young, poor, and often in domestic service to the priest, they were dependent. If they became pregnant, they bore the consequences alone. Some were forced to leave the village. Others gave their children up to convents or monasteries, although the church protected its own. It occasionally disciplined priests for sexual misconduct, especially if their actions disrupted public order. Punishments included transfer to a remote parish, temporary suspension from office, fines, or penance, public confession before the bishop in rare cases. The church preferred containment over confrontation. A scandalized parish could be pacified by moving the offending priest elsewhere, thus spreading the problem rather than solving it. One chronicler in 1327 wryly noted, "The priest who leaves in disgrace returns to villages over, wearing a different robe but carrying the same sins." While parish priests bore the brunt of public scrutiny, monasteries meant to be sanctuaries of silence and discipline were not immune, particularly in wealthier abbeys. Some monks grew lax. Visitors complained of lavish meals and wine secret liaisons with women in the surrounding villages, monks fathering children and paying local midwives to keep quiet. One bishop's inspection of a Benedictine monastery in Kent noted, "There are whispers of nuns leaving the cloister under cover of night and brothers drinking in the alehouse by dawn." Such behavior was the exception, not the rule. But each scandal diminished the church's authority, especially among peasants who saw the hypocrisy firsthand. When a midwife delivered a child born of a monk, the entire village knew. And yet, what could they do? The church was the law. To accuse it openly was to risk excommunication, a spiritual death sentence. The higher the priest's rank, the harder it became to challenge him. Bishops, abbots, and even cardinals were sometimes implicated in affairs, particularly in the later Middle Ages. Their status provided insulation. They could bribe witnesses, threaten families, or dismiss accusations as slander. When rumors spread, The church closed ranks, preferring institutional reputation over justice. One of the most famous cases involved Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, who openly fathered multiple children and placed them in positions of power. Though he lived in the Renaissance era, his conduct cast a long shadow back over the Middle Ages, fueling Protestant critiques of clerical corruption. But for the average village priest, scandal rarely ended in promotion. It ended in disgrace, or worse, in a ruined woman's life. By the 14th century, many lay people had developed a dual attitude toward the church: reverence for the sacraments, cynicism toward the clergy. A peasant might kneel during Mass, but whisper that the priest drinks more than he prays. A widow might confess her sins, but refuse to send her daughter to serve in the rectory. Faith remained, but trust faltered. It is in this tension that we see the seeds of future upheaval. The church had built an empire on morality, but when that morality cracked, even the most devout began to question. Though few had the power to confront priests directly, refused to serve in certain households midwives, women fled to other villages or even joined Beguine communities, lay religious groups for women seeking autonomy. These acts may seem small, but they mattered. They kept memory alive. They carved out pockets of dignity, and in rare cases, they forced the church to act. But if the church faltered in its own morals, why did people continue to trust it? What role did fear, ritual, and community play in sustaining belief despite the evidence? What kept the system going, even when its shepherds had gone astray? By all accounts, the system should have broken. Priests fathering children, monks sneaking out at night, confessions weaponized, and women punished more harshly than men. It was a moral machine lurching under its own contradictions. And yet, the church did not collapse. It did not lose its hold on the medieval peasant. In fact, for centuries, it grew stronger, expanding its reach into every crevice of personal life. So why did people continue to trust it? Because, for all its faults, the church offered something no other institution could in medieval Europe: a pathway through suffering. Medieval life was harsh, short lifespans, plagues, failed harvests, war, and death. In such a world, people desperately needed an explanation. The church provided it. Why did your child die in the night? Because God is testing your faith. Why did a flood ruin your crops? Because His sins are being revealed through sin and punishment, confession and redemption. The church offered a narrative for an otherwise chaotic world, and that narrative, despite its flaws, was deeply comforting. Ritual was the great binding agent between church and people. Every stage of life was marked by sacred ceremony: baptism at birth, to cleanse original sin; first confession and communion in adolescence; marriage, sanctioned and witnessed by God; anointing of the sick, preparing one for death; and finally, burial in consecrated ground, sealing one's soul in eternal hope. These rituals weren't optional. They were essential to the medieval psyche, and even when the priest was corrupt, the ritual still held power. The community believed that God's grace operated through the priest, not because of his worthiness. The words of absolution were valid, even if the mouth that spoke them was sinful. It was a powerful idea. God worked despite man's flaws. One of the most compelling tools in the church's arsenal was fear, not just of sin, but of what came after. Hell was no abstraction. It was vividly imagined. Fire and brimstone eternal pain demons, with hook sinners roasted on spits. Their sins marked on their bodies. Preachers described these torments in graphic detail, often in open-air sermons meant to stir both guilt and awe. And for the illiterate peasant, church wall paintings often reinforced the message: helmets swallowing the impure, angels weighing souls, demons dragging the lustful into darkness. This wasn't just storytelling, it was moral architecture. Confession and penance weren't just duties, they were lifelines. Even the most skeptical peasant didn't want to risk eternity. The village church wasn't just a place of prayer, was the heart of the community. It marriages and deaths. It rang bells at dawn, noon, and dusk. It housed the only readable texts in the region. It was often the only stone building in sight. To reject the church was to reject belonging. Even those critical of priests still attended Mass. Even those mocked by neighbors still lit candles for their dead. Even those excommunicated sometimes sat quietly in the back pew, hoping to be seen and forgiven. This is what made the system durable. Its social gravity. It wrapped belief, culture, and identity into one. Amid the regulation, the corruption, and the shame, it's important not to forget that many clergy were deeply sincere. There were priests who fasted alongside their poor monks, who copied sacred texts late into the night. Nuns who tended to plague victims abandoned by everyone else. Confessors, who listened with patience and offered gentle words instead of judgment. Not every confession was traumatic. Many were healing. Not every sermon was a threat. Some were hopeful. Not every priest was a hypocrite. Some were heroes of their time. The church, after all, was not a single man, it was a vast body of contradictions. And it is this coexistence of abuse and compassion, rigidity and mercy, that makes its history so human. Much of what we see in the Church of the Middle Ages persists in modern forms. Institutions that claim moral authority while hiding scandal. Confession, tension between public sin and private redemption, the longing for moral clarity in a confusing world, and perhaps most of all, the need for grace not as permission, but as a second chance. So what did the church teach peasants about their flesh? That it was weak, that it was dangerous, that it could lead to eternal ruin, but also, beneath the layers of doctrine, that it was redeemable. The confessional, for all its invasiveness, was also a place of second beginnings. The peasant who had sinned could walk away lighter. The man who doubted could still kneel and be accepted. The church may have policed the flesh, but in doing so, it also preserved a belief that every soul mattered, no matter how dirty, how lustful, or how lowborn, and that, in the end, may be why the confessional door was never fully closed. What happens when institutions built to purify the soul become entangled in the same sins they condemn? And what does it say about us that we continue to believe even when belief feels compromised? It's one thing to imagine a medieval peasant couple falling in love. It's another to imagine where they might consummate that love. Not in a curtained bedroom, not behind closed doors, not even in a room of their own. The truth is blunt. There was no privacy. And yet, human nature doesn't wait for convenience. So where, in the cramped, communal, Medieval world of medieval Europe, did ordinary people actually have sex? To answer that, we must explore the landscapes of desire, compromise, and occasional creativity. Most peasant homes were one-room dwellings shared by the entire family, parents, children, and often grandparents. Domestic animals like chickens, goats, and even pigs frequently shared this space, especially at night or during winter. The house was small, dark, and smoky. The central hearth provided heat, light, and cooking, but also filled the home with smoke due to poor ventilation. Furniture was minimal, perhaps a trestle table, a bench, and if the family was lucky, a bed. But even the bed wasn't private. In many homes, multiple people slept in the same bed, parents and children, siblings, or even visiting travelers. Beds were expensive. Mattresses were sacks filled with straw, fleas, and hardship. Blankets were communal. To imagine intimacy in this setting requires shifting expectations. There were no romantic evenings. There was opportunity, or the lack of it. While others were present or nearby, children learned to sleep through the noises of adult life. Siblings turned away or pretended not to see. In some cultures, even newlyweds were expected to consummate their marriage in the same room as parents or friends. During public bedding rituals, what modern minds interpret as a violation of privacy, medieval minds interpreted as normal. Shame was social, not spatial. So long as the act occurred within marriage, in the right position, missionary, and not during forbidden times, Lent. Yet, human instinct being what it is, some still sought privacy, or at least a quieter place. That's when the barn came in. If the house was too crowded or too sacred, the barn became a favorite trysting spot. Barns were often detached from the main house. They had soft hay or straw piles. They were warm in winter and cool in summer. And most importantly, they were unoccupied. At night, many manorial court records mention couples found in the barn or lying together upon the hay. These phrases were coded language for sexual activity, and while frowned upon, but testing boundaries. This practice wasn't always condemned. In some regions, it was even tolerated as a form of trial union, especially if marriage was likely. Of course, things didn't always go as planned. Unwanted pregnancies, fights between families, or accusations of fornication sometimes followed, and the barn, once a private retreat, became evidence. Other common places for intimacy included field margins. During rest breaks from harvest work, forest paths, especially for those tending pigs or collecting firewood, herding shelters, distant, quiet, and far from the watchful village. In one 14th century manorial record from Norfolk, a couple was fined for laying together under the elm at the edge of the west pasture. The wording suggests the entire village knew the treand, its rolas, a lover's rendezvous. Shepherding, dairying, and berry picking were often solitary jobs given to young peasants. These tasks offered moments of privacy. Love letters were rare, but verbal promises, trysts, and bundling occurred. Sometimes affection, sometimes coercion, often a blurred line between both. Though alehouses were primarily centers for drinking, gambling, and community talk, they also became spaces of intimacy. Some alehouses had upstairs rooms or outbuildings where patrons could sneak away, whether rented or borrowed. These spaces offered more privacy than a haystack. Women who worked in alehouses, especially if unwed, were often the subject of rumor and moral policing. Their proximity to men and ale made them suspect. Some were falsely accused. Others used the space for transactional relationships. The Church frequently warned against the sinfulness of the alewife, associating drink, laughter, and sex with damnation. But the alehouse remained vital to peasant sociability and a liminal space where rules could bend. In larger towns, public bathhouses offered yet another curious possibility. Before the Reformation, bathing was not considered sinful. In fact, in the 13th and 14th centuries, mixed-gender bathhouses existed in many English towns. These spaces were social, sensual, and soaked in implication. While full nudity was uncommon, partial exposure and physical closeness blurred lines, though more common in urban settings. Such experiences occasionally trickled into rural consciousness. Rivers, ponds, and communal washing areas could become sites of flirtation or rendezvous. Water, like hay, softened the boundary between duty and desire. When trysts were discovered, often small but symbolic public penance, such as confession or humiliation, forced marriage. If pregnancy resulted, community gossip, which could last a lifetime. In a 1321 record from Suffolk, a woman named Margaret was fined for lying with a man not her husband in the barn behind the Reeves house. The fine was small, 2 pence, but the damage was done. Her marriage prospects dimmed. Her name appeared again in future roles for petty theft, public drunkenness, and finally, disappearance. The barn had no walls, but its consequences echoed through stone. So what happened when trysts turned into pregnancies? How did couples navigate the thin line between desire and duty? A moment stolen behind the hedgerow, the sound of hooves or wind masking, hurried whispers and faster heartbeats, then silence. And a month later, no blood, no relief. A body changing in the medieval world. Sex was not just a personal act, it was a gamble, especially for women. A tryst in the field could yield momentary closeness, but if it led to pregnancy, the consequences could unravel a life, especially if there was no ring, no promise, and no father willing to step forward. Contrary to the idealized vision of a pious and orderly medieval society, illegitimate births were not rare, especially in rural communities. Most manorial and ecclesiastical records show regular fines for fornication and lewd behavior, often tied to pregnancies. While the Church preached abstinence and chastity, the practical reality was that many couples tested one another before marriage. Sometimes this led to honest unions. Sometimes it led to disaster. A 14th century record from Lancashire tells of a girl named Elise, aged about 16, who was discovered to be pregnant. The father, a man from a neighboring village, denied her. The local priest fined both families for concealing the sin. Elise later appears in the record, again not as a mother, but as a wet nurse to another household. She had lost the child. No further mention of her survives. When a pregnancy occurred, a quiet sisterhood emerged. Women who helped women behind the back sore, at least the blind eyes of their communities. Midwives played an essential role, not just in childbirth, but in managing shame, hiding early pregnancies, and occasionally procuring herbal remedies to bring on a late cycle. Abortifacients did exist, though the Church condemned them outright. Common ingredients included pennyroyal, type of juniper, mugwort, tansy. These herbs were brewed into teas or applied in poultices. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they killed the woman instead of the fetus. And yet, women took the risk, especially those who feared being cast out or condemned. Pregnant and unmarried, a woman would almost certainly be called before the parish priest. In confession, she might be urged to name the father, to express sorrow, to commit to penance. Some priests were gentle, others demanded public apology. In many villages, wrapped in linen, kneeling during Mass, holding a candle at the altar, walking a set number of miles in pilgrimage, the father, if he, confessor, was known, might be fined, but usually he went on with his life, especially if he had land or status, or simply the advantage of denial. If the woman had no family to protect her, she might become a servant, a beggar, or be sent to work in a leper house. And yet some survived. Pregnancy before marriage wasn't always a tragedy. In some villages, if the father agreed to marry the woman quickly, the couple could legitimize the child and escape scandal. These shotgun weddings, though the term is modern, were encouraged by priests and manorial courts alike, both of which preferred stability over shame. In fact, some couples arranged to get caught so they could marry sooner. Records show Thomas and Joan are fined for lying together before marriage, but being now wed, the fine is forgiven. In such cases, the act was retroactively cleansed. The child would not be called a bastard. The family's honor was salvaged, barely. This strategy, though common, was risky. If the man refused, the woman was left alone, and the child bore the mark of sin. 4 children born outside of wedlock, their future depended heavily on whether the father acknowledged them, whether the mother could remarry, whether the community forgave, or at least forgot. Some were absorbed into extended families. Others were placed into apprenticeships early by age 8 or 9. Still others entered monastic life, fostered by abbeys in return for labor or donation. The word bastard wasn't just a slur, was a legal category. It meant no right to inherit land, no claim to family name, no access to lineage. And yet, some of these children thrived. One became a reeve, another a traveling merchant, a third the mistress of a steward. Their success didn't erase the shame, but it challenged it. In tight-knit villages, nothing remained secret for long. A pregnancy that began in a haystack became a lifetime of whispers. That's Martha's girl. You know no father. She's lucky. The priest looked kindly. The child was born too soon after the wedding, wasn't it? Even if the child proved clever, strong, or kind, the stain lingered. Gossip wasn't just talk. It was social enforcement, and it made sure the community remembered. But memory could also fade. A helpful daughter, a generous mother, a man who kept to his field and paid his dues over time. The village might let it go. Forgiveness, in this way, wasn't just spiritual. It was slowly earned, socially negotiated. Not all trysts ended in shame. Some turned into marriages that lasted decades. These couples laughed about their beginnings behind closed doors. They remembered the smell of hay or the thrill of a midnight field. They raised children, tilled land, and aged together. Their unions began in places the church disapproved of, but they endured, and in the end, the barn became just a barn again. The field grew wheat, the gossip faded. All that remained was a life. But what about those whose desires didn't fit the expected mold at all? What of the peasants who didn't love the opposite sex or who refused marriage entirely? Was there any space for such lives in a world built on tradition? By now, you know the usual script: a man and a woman sneaking into a barn or slipping behind the trees, dodging parents and priests, stealing moments in a world that didn't make room for privacy. But what if your desires didn't follow that script? What if you didn't want to marry? What if you didn't want children? What if the one you longed for was someone of the same sex? In the medieval world, where intimacy and reproduction were tightly bound, such deviations were rarely acknowledged, almost never understood, yet they existed. And they, too, had to find quiet places, hidden between the church and the fields, where unconventional desires could breathe for a moment. Though marriage was the expected endpoint for nearly every peasant, not everyone followed that path. Some chose celibacy not for religious reasons, but for practical or personal ones, avoiding the economic burden of a family, fear of childbirth, especially for women who had seen sisters die, a desire for independence, lack of attraction, romantic or sexual, to any potential partner. These individuals often remained within their family homes or joined the labor force. Women, in particular, might become spinsters, originally a term for wool workers, midwives, or herb women. Such people lived on the edges of the social script, tolerated, sometimes respected, but always observed, and always vulnerable to suspicion. While medieval people had no language for asexuality or aromanticism, the behaviors existed. Some people simply didn't seek romantic or sexual connection. They worked, prayed, cared for animals or kin. They expressed love through labor, kindness, or spiritual devotion. These individuals were sometimes praised by the church, especially women, for their chastity. But this praise was often conditional, so long as they remained obedient, useful, and pious. The moment they questioned authority or lived too freely, the same traits that marked them as pure could be twisted into labels like witch, heretic, or unnatural. Homosexuality, male or female, was condemned by church law as sodomy, a vague term encompassing a range of acts deemed unnatural, yet the historical record shows it happened. In urban settings, especially among apprentices and students, male-male intimacy was documented. Court records mention men found lying together in lewd fashion or kissing as a husband and wife. In villages, the evidence is sparser, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Consider same-sex friendships between peasants that were unusually close, lifelong cohabitation between two women midwives or herb women who never married, but traveled together, male servants who moved from village to village, never marrying, but always in the company of another man. Were these relationships romantic, sexual, familial? The records don't say, but the possibility hangs between the lines. The barn, the field, the forest, these weren't just places of romantic trysts. They were also the few places where those outside the norm could exist without constant scrutiny. A pair of boys working as threshers might share more than just tools. Two girls sent to gather herbs might walk home more slowly than needed. Two older widows might sit together in the hayloft, watching children play, their own love unspoken. These stories aren't always recorded, but they survive in the silences, in the gossip that trailed them, in the rumors of strange affection or unnatural fondness. Even in condemnation, their presence becomes real. When same-sex relations were discovered, the The consequences could be devastating. Fines, public whipping, excommunication in rare cases, execution, particularly for men, but often the village chose secrecy over scandal. In rural communities, where labor and cooperation were more valuable than moral perfection, many unusual relationships were ignored unless they disrupted the social order. This wasn't acceptance, but it was a form of tolerance, by necessity. So long as the cows were milked, the fields were tilled, and the church bell rang, some things went unspoken. In a world that demanded conformity, those who lived differently showed a quiet kind of resistance. They carved out lives with no blueprint, often alone, sometimes in pairs, rarely with protection. Their resilience was not marked by revolution, but by routine. They found joy where they could, in laughter, in song, in the softness of straw beneath the stars. They endured slander, exile, sometimes worse, but they existed, and their presence, however rarely recorded, is part of the story. For most peasants, desire was tethered to reproduction, marriage, and survival. But some desires drifted, without promise, without future. They lived in the moment. A stolen touch in the dushka glance across the alehouse, a whispered joke shared in secreted memory, kept for decades. These moments were fragile, unsanctioned, and sometimes fleeting, but they were real, and even in a world ruled by rules, such moments found their places in Bodie barns, in dirty hay, and in the unwritten margins of history. How many lives have gone unrecorded, not because they didn't matter, but because they didn't fit the story we expected? And how many barns, haylofts, and hedgerows once bore witness to love the world refused to name? It began quietly, a fever here, a swollen node there, a strange silence over the village well, then the screams, the smell, the wagons filled with bodies. Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death swept across Europe, wiping out between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population. Entire villages vanished. Families were cut in half. Lovers were left alone. In a time when touch could mean death, what happened to intimacy? When the body became both dangerous and sacred, did love retreat or evolve? This is the story of desire. In an age of fear, of how peasants, already living precarious lives, faced a horror that threatened not just their survival, but the very meaning of closeness. To understand intimacy during the Black Death, we must first understand the plague's brutality. It came in 3 forms: bubonic, the most common, with swollen lymph nodes, buboes, high fever, and death in 3 to 5 days; pneumonic, airborne, and faster, affecting the lungs, leading to suffocation within 24 to 48 hours; septicemic, rarest but deadliest, it killed within a day, often without buboes. The disease spread along trade routes and through human contact, touch, breath, shared bedding, kisses, childbirth. In a world where most people shared a bed, a bowl, a cup, a blanket, this was catastrophic. As the plague advanced, fear of contact escalated. Husbands refused to sleep beside their wives. Parents abandoned sick children. Priests stopped offering last rites. Midwives disappeared. Entire families boarded up homes and refused to open them. Records from Italy to England tell of people dying alone, their bodies untouched, their final hours unmarked by even a hand on the forehead. Touch, once a form of love, healing, and sex, became a threat. And so, a terrifying question emerged. If closeness meant danger, how could anyone dare to love? The church had long preached restraint. Sex was only acceptable within marriage, and even then, only for procreation, not pleasure. But the Black Death shattered theological certainty. Some saw the plague as God's punishment for lust and sin. Sermons warned against fornication, marched from town to town, whipping themselves to cleanse the world of carnal evil. Others took the opposite view. If death was coming, why deny the flesh? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. This gave rise to contradictory behaviors. Some villages imposed strict moral codes. Others descended into wild revelry orgies, drunken festivals, and rushed marriages. Priests denounced sin from pulpits, then took lovers behind closed doors. The same church that forbade pleasure now struggled to explain death, and in doing so, lost its hold over many hearts. In normal times, marriage was a carefully negotiated process involving families, dowries, and church approval. But the plague upended everything. Young people married in haste, fearing they'd die. Unmarried, betrothed couples were separated by quarantines or death. Widows and widowers remarried within weeks, sometimes days. Priests, overwhelmed by burials, performed mass weddings with minimal ceremony. Marriage became both a shield and a salve way to find comfort in the face of death, even if it couldn't guarantee survival. And still, many people chose not to marry at all. Why bind yourself when the end was likely near? Perhaps the most profound expression of intimacy during the Black Death wasn't found in sex or marriage, but in grief. A woman washing the body of her sister, a boy holding his dying mother's hand as no one else would, a widower sleeping beside his wife's grave because the bed was too empty, a priest breaking his own vows to give last rites to a friend. In these moments, love defied fear. It persisted not in pleasure, but in presence, and that too was a kind of resistance. After the plague passed, survivors were left with phantom touches, the lover they hadn't dared to kiss, the child they couldn't cradle, the wife they never said goodbye to. For some, this grief turned to madness. Others buried it in labor, religion, or remarriage. Some never touched again. The barn stood empty. The fields grew quiet. Where once hay rustled with life, now there was only memory. But what came next? When the dead were buried and the disease retreated, did love return as before, or did intimacy change forever in a world that had learned to fear the body? Death had passed. The silence it left behind was deafening. Villages had lost half their inhabitants. Churches stood half empty. Fields lay fallow. Bells that once rang for marriages and feast days now tolled mostly for the dead. But in this quiet, something strange began to stir. Not just grief, but appetite. Not just mourning, but longing. Because, once the world had ended damned, then, impossibly, kept going. People returned to what they knew best, life in all its messy bodily insistence. And with life came the body. And with the body came desire. With so many dead, land opened up. Hovels sat abandoned. Entire homesteads had no heir. Fields went to seed, waiting for a plow. This sudden shift gave many peasants a freedom they'd never known. Young people, especially, found themselves in empty homes, with no parents, no siblings, and often no supervision. For the first time, Privacy wasn't a luxury yet, was everywhere, and into these quiet spaces came sex not furtive, not whispered. Widowers, many of them, still young, still capable of love, and often, suddenly independent. A woman once bound by a controlling husband was now free to choose her next. A man once denied land could now remarry with property in hand. Old friends, both grieving, turned to each other, not out of lust, but comfort, marriage. Records show a noticeable spike in remarriages in the 1350s. Some were strategic, others were impulsive. In one village in Lincolnshire, a woman named Alisoun married 3 times between 1349 and 1353, each husband dying of plague. After her 3rd widowhood, she never married again, but lived with a younger man, described in the records only as Thomas, her keeper. She kept her name. He kept her company. The church, still reeling from the loss of priests and believers, relaxed certain moral expectations. Fewer priests meant less confession, more weddings occurred outside churches. Sexual behavior became harder to monitor, let alone punish. Some saw this as a spiritual collapse. Others saw it as liberation. A popular poem from the period reads, "Since death has danced on every door, why blush for kisses nevermore?" The church, once the great regulator of desire, now found itself struggling to keep up with the people who had seen the world end and found the old rules no longer held. For some, sex, after the plague, became more than instinct. It became an act of defiance against the church that couldn't stop the dying, against the lords who fled their manors while peasants buried the bodies, against the silence that hung in every village. Laughter returned. So did music. So did the alehouse, tryst, and the harvest flirtation. Court records show renewed cases of fornication, bastardy, and broken betrothals, but fewer fines, fewer public penances, and more community forgiveness. Desire, once tightly controlled, had become a form of survival. With the labor shortage came leverage. Peasants could demand better pay, improved conditions, and in some cases choose their spouses freely. No longer bound to their lord's will, the rigid customs of arranged marriage began to loosen. A young man with strong arms and no land could now marry a widow with property. A milkmaid could choose a second husband without her parents' blessing. The balance of power began to shift modestly but meaningfully. The plague had torn the old world down in its place. Something new, more equal, more bodily, began to take root. Cultural expressions after the Black Death became earthier, even Bodhi. In Boccaccio's Decameron, written in 1353, 10 young nobles flee Florence to escape the plague. Their days are spent telling stories of love, lust, and trickery, often involving peasants, nuns, and priests in compromising positions. The message was clear. Death had humbled all. Desire spared none, and the line between sacred and profane had blurred. Peasant humor, too, took on a raunchier tone. Jokes, songs, and riddles from the late 14th century reflect a world where sex was no longer whispered, but laughed about, sung about, claimed, even as plague returned in later decades. The first great wave left a permanent mark, the understanding that love, especially physical love, was finite. People touched more, not less. They sought out lovers. They married faster. They forgave more desire. rather than being viewed only as sin, became a form of human assertion, a way to say, I am still here, I want, I feel, and in that wanting, people found renewal. But what of the children born from these hasty unions and fearless nights? How did the next generation, shaped by death and intimacy, carry the legacy of a world reborn in shadow? The fields had grown wild, the villages were quiet, but beneath the soil, new life was already taking root. From the despair of plague came a generation born not just of survival, but of desire, a generation of children conceived in the uncertain years after the first great wave of the Black Death. Some were born of hurried marriages, others from temporary unions, forgotten trysts, or shared grief. Many never knew their fathers, some never knew their mothers, but all of them, every child, was a symbol that intimacy had not died, even when the world nearly had in the wake of the plague. Europe faced a startling reality. Too much land, too few people, entire manors had no heirs. Local populations were decimated. In some English villages, half of the population was under the age of 15 within a decade. This shift opened space, literal and figurative, for those previously pushed to the margins. Bastard children were quietly absorbed into households. Illegitimate daughters inherited cottages once denied to women. Second-born sons, once destined for servitude, now became landholders. The old social hierarchies had been loosened by necessity, and love especially. Non-sanctioned love had left a permanent human legacy. Parents of this new generation, especially those who had lost previous families, often approached child-rearing with a mixture of caution and tenderness. They had seen death up close. They had watched infants die within hours, siblings vanish within days, and so surviving children were often nursed longer, even into toddlerhood, given more emotional attention, especially by widowed mothers, raised in multi-generational or communal households, since many families had fused during or after the plague. These households, born of survival and grief, created unusual social units. A child might be raised by a widowed aunt, a grandmother, or even by an older sibling who had become head of house at 16. And within those homes, stories were told of the plague, of those lost, of fleeting loves and brave unions that defied the church, the law, or propriety. Many children, born in the post-plague years, were the product of unconventional relationships: a servant girl and a tenant farmer who never wed, a widow and her late husband's cousin, a priest's abandoned son, raised by a midwife, two peasants who found each other during a quarantine, married after their first child was born. These stories rarely made it into official records, but their traces remain in church rolls, land grants, and whispered folk tales. Some children were later legitimized, as the church began to tolerate late marriages and retroactive blessings. Others were simply accepted, because the village had seen too much to care about ceremony anymore. Children raised in the decades after the Black Death inherited more than land or status. They inherited a worldview shaped by absence. They grew up with fewer siblings, fewer elders, fewer normal expectations. This created a generation marked by ambition, with more opportunities than their parents ever had, skepticism, especially toward authority, which had failed them during crisis. Closeness, valuing family ties and chosen bonds over formal hierarchy. And within this worldview, intimacy changed. It became less about permission and more about connection. Even among peasants, memory became a kind of emotional inheritance. Village songs began to include verses about the dark year or the winter without fathers. Wedding customs evolved, often incorporating candles or prayers to remember the dead. Children were named after lost relatives, especially lovers separated by death. This new ritual spoke volumes. It showed that intimacy wasn't erased by fear. It had grown roots in grief, and the children who played under those trees grew up knowing that love, though dangerous, was worth pursuing. By the mid-15th century, Europe's population was slowly recovering. The initial trauma of the plague had faded, but its emotional blueprint remained. The generation raised in the aftermath would go on to marry with more agency, challenge church authority, especially in coming reformations, express themselves more openly in folk traditions, song, and humor. Value presence, the shared body, the shared bed, the shared loaf of bread over ideals. Desire had been tempered by fire, but it had not been destroyed. The Black Death nearly killed the body, but in the generations that followed, the body came back, not just as a vessel for work or reproduction, but as a site of memory, meaning, and joy. The child born in a barn to a weeping mother, the couple who wed by candlelight with no priest present, the man who held his lover's hand and lived when everyone else died. These were not footnotes. They were the new foundation, and their legacy lived on not in stone cathedrals, but in the flesh of generations who loved again, despite it all. When history breaks the body, how does the body rebuild itself? And is it possible that love, quiet, imperfect, unsanctioned, survives, not in defiance of death, but because of it? Imagine a world where your neighbors could drag you into court for kissing someone else's spouse behind the alehouse. Behind the alehouse was sleeping with the wrong person, wasn't just a private shame. It was a community event, punishable by fines, humiliation, and long memory. In the medieval village, sex wasn't secret, and adultery wasn't just a moral failing, it was a legal offense, heard in manorial courts, judged by local lords or stewards, and witnessed by everyone you knew. This is the story of adultery in the open, where the law walked hand in hand with gossip, and justice sometimes looked a lot like public entertainment. Before the rise of modern national courts, justice was local. Each manoran estate of land controlled by a lord held its own court baron or court leet. These were not grand institutions. They met in barns, alehouses, or under large trees. Attendance was mandatory for tenants. Cases heard included land disputes, broken tools and fences, theft of chickens or firewood, and, yes, moral offenses, including adultery, fornication, and lechery. The court was presided over by the lord, his steward, or sometimes a local reeve, a peasant elected by peers. Jurors were drawn from the village. Everyone knew everyone, which meant that if you were accused of adultery, your entire social world heard the details. In the eyes of the manorial court, fornication was sex between two unmarried people. Adultery was sex between at least one married person and someone else. Lechery was a vague term used for general sexual misconduct. Adultery carried a heavier stigma, not just because it was more sinful, but because it threatened property and lineage. a peasant's wife having another man's child meant inheritance was at risk. A husband sleeping with another man's wife could trigger feuds, fines, and even violence. And so, when suspicion arose, the matter didn't stay behind closed doors. It went to court. Often it wasn't, or at least not formally. But when it was, the evidence came from witnesses, usually neighbors or servants, who claimed to see the pair together. Pregnancy, especially if the husband was absent or known to be impotent. Confession, sometimes coerced. Gossip, which became too loud to ignore. Sometimes the couple was caught in the act in a barn, in a field, in a cottage, while the spouse was away. These moments could lead to immediate complaints brought before the court. More often, though the evidence was circumstantial, frequent meetings, unexplained absences, suggestive behavior, and once rumors began, they were hard to stop. The accused were rarely given legal counsel. Instead, their reputation became the trial. Was the woman known to be flirtatious? Had the man been seen too often with the neighbor's wife? Had the husband complained of his wife's coldness or absence? The court might hear from multiple villagers. Statements like, "I saw the said Robert enter the widow's cottage after dusk and leave before dawn. Alice was heard moaning in the barn with a man not her husband. Thomas, the miller, said his wife no longer comes to his bed." These testimonies could be damning or deeply biased. Truth was hard to know, but appearances were everything. If found guilty, punishments included fines ranging from a few pence to shillings, depending on status. Public penance, such as standing barefoot in church or wearing a symbolic garment. Humiliation, such as sitting backward on a donkey or being paraded through the village. Reconciliation ceremonies, where the couple was forced to make peace under public view. Sometimes, one party, often the woman, was exiled, sent to live with relatives in another manor, or made to serve in penance. Very rarely, if violence resulted from the affair, death occurred not from court sentence, but from jealous husbands, vengeful kins, or community justice. Though both men and women could be accused, women bore the greater burden. They were more likely to be punished. Even if both parties were guilty, a pregnant woman could not hide the affair. A man's infidelity might be dismissed as lust. A woman's was treachery. In one 1382 court roll from Kent, a woman named Juliana was whipped for inviting the company of men into her husband's home. The men were fined, then released. Juliana disappeared from the records. The house was later sold. Even after punishment, the stigma often remained. A woman labeled as unchaste found it hard to remarry or find work. A man known as a lech could be ostracized at alehouses or denied business. Children of suspected adulterers might be mocked or worse, denied inheritance. The manorial court ended with a sentence, but the village court of memory never closed. Gossip persisted. Stories were retold. Lives were reshaped. This is the tragic heart of so many adultery cases. They weren't always about lust. Sometimes the married woman had been forced into a match. Sometimes the unmarried man was her childhood friend. Sometimes they'd loved each other before parents interfered. And in those rare court records where emotion peeks through, we see not just law, but longing. The woman wept and said she loved him before her husband took her. The man begged the court to let her go with him. The court ruled no. The fine was paid, and they were never mentioned again. But what of those whose affairs lasted for years, who lived together, laughed together, and grew old side by side without church or court permission? Were there ways to love outside the law and survive? For all the courts, fines, and public scoldings, not every affair ended in scandal. Some lovers persisted, year after year, living just outside the lines of marriage, quietly, skillfully, sometimes even with the village's complicity. These were not always tales of lust or sin. They were relationships of survival, comfort, or even devotion. They weren't supposed to exist, but they did, and sometimes they endured longer than many legal marriages. The manorial system revolved around families' economic units bound by marriage and children, but records show a surprising number of irregular households. A man living with a woman called his housekeeper, though they shared a bed. A widow who never remarried but lived with a male cousin no one had seen before. Two married people who had separated, but each quietly lived with someone new. These unions were unofficial, unblessed by the church, but they were real. Sometimes they were hidden. Other times, everyone knew and simply looked the other way. While the church condemned sin, the village often had pragmatic reasons to tolerate it. Labor. A man and woman living together could farm a plot more efficiently. Stability. If the couple caused no disruption, their relationship was easier to ignore than punish. Mutual aid. Neighbors helped neighbors, even those with complicated beds. Lack of clergy. In remote areas, no priest meant no marriage, so people made their own arrangements. This wasn't forgiveness. It was functional tolerance. After all, everyone had something to hide. A past love, a stolen kiss, a late-night visit to the barn. The manorial court may have enforced public morality, but private morality lived in the hedgerows and hearths, in whispered stories and tacit agreements. Some lovers couldn't or wouldn't stay apart, no matter how often they were fined. In a village in Sussex, between 1371 and 1378, a woman named Alice and a man named Stephen were brought before the court 6 times for continuing in lewd familiarity despite public rebuke. The court tried, fines, public penance, forced separation appeals to their families. Nothing worked. By 1380, they simply stopped appearing in the records. Some say they left the village. Others believe the steward grew tired of prosecuting a love that wouldn't end, whatever the truth. Their names became part of local folklore. Alice and Stephen, stubborn with the heart. When long-standing affairs produced children, the situation became more complicated. If the mother was married to someone else, the child's legitimacy was questioned. If the father was married, he might deny paternity to protect his estate. In some cases, the child was quietly adopted by the husband, especially if the affair was known but ignored. But in many cases, especially when both parents were unmarried, the child was simply absorbed into daily life. The village might murmur, the steward might issue a fine, but unless a land claim or dispute arose, the matter rarely escalated. These children grew up like others, in the fields, the church, the alehouse. Their origins might follow them, but their usefulness mattered more.